The fastest way to lose the wrong person is to finally see them clearly. I did not know that sentence would define the worst night of my life until I walked through the apartment door and realized everything I believed was a lie. My name is Emma Collins. I was 26 years old, working 2 jobs, sharing rent with a man I thought I would eventually marry, and convincing myself that loyalty always mattered in the end. Looking back, the signs had been there for months. The late-night messages he hid. The sudden business trips that never made sense. The distracted smile whenever I talked about our future. But love has a strange way of turning obvious things invisible. That Friday evening started like every other. The Chicago sky was turning orange beyond the apartment windows. I carried a paper bag filled with takeout from his favorite restaurant because I wanted to surprise him after a long week. I remember feeling happy. Not excited. Not overwhelmed. Just quietly happy. The kind of happiness that comes from believing your life is finally becoming stable. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Then everything stopped. The laughter came first. A woman's laughter. Soft. Comfortable. Familiar in a way that immediately felt wrong. My heart dropped before my mind understood why. I walked farther into the apartment, still holding the bag in my hands. The living room lights were on. 2 wine glasses sat on the coffee table. And there he was. Ryan. The man who had spent 3 years promising me forever. The man who looked at me now with an expression that was not guilt. It was panic. Beside him sat a woman I had never met. She looked just as shocked to see me as I was to see her. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The silence felt louder than any argument could have been. I looked at Ryan and waited for an explanation. None came. He stood up quickly. Emma, I can explain. It was amazing how those 4 words instantly made everything worse. Can you? I asked quietly. My voice sounded strangely calm. Ryan ran a hand through his hair. This is not what it looks like. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. Then tell me what it looks like, I said. Neither of them answered. And in that moment I knew. Every canceled plan. Every excuse. Every strange feeling I had ignored. The truth was suddenly standing in front of me, impossible to avoid. I placed the takeout bag on the kitchen counter with careful hands. Felt important not to drop it. Not because of the food. Because I refused to let my heartbreak be the thing that made me lose control. Ryan stepped closer. Emma, please. I shook my head. Do not. He stopped immediately. For the first time I saw him clearly. Not the version I had loved. Not the version I had defended to friends and family. Just a man who had made a choice and hoped I would never discover it. The realization hurt less than I expected. What hurt was understanding how long I had been loving someone who no longer existed. I picked up my purse from the table near the door. Ryan looked genuinely frightened now. Where are you going? He asked. I looked at him one final time. Away from this. Then I walked out. The apartment door closed behind me with a quiet click. No dramatic ending. No screaming. No revenge. Just silence. But as I stepped into the cool Chicago night and felt the wind against my face, I had no idea that losing the man I thought I needed was about to lead me directly toward the man who would change everything. The cold air outside hit me the moment the apartment door closed behind me. Chicago at night always felt louder when your life had just fallen apart. Cars passed by on the street below, headlights cutting through the darkness like nothing important had changed in the world except mine. I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, still holding my purse, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were steady but my chest was not. It felt like something inside me had quietly cracked without making a sound. I did not cry. Not yet. I just walked. I did not know where I was going. I only knew I could not stay there. The city swallowed me as I moved down the block, passing glowing signs, distant conversations, and the soft hum of nightlife beginning to wake up. Everything around me felt normal. That was the strangest part. My entire world had collapsed and the city kept moving as if nothing had happened. After several blocks, I stopped near a crosswalk and leaned slightly against a streetlight. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself. That was when I noticed the hotel across the street. It was not unusual for Chicago. Tall, elegant, glass reflecting gold light from inside. People moved in and out of the lobby with quiet confidence, as if they belonged there. I did not. I should have kept walking. I should have gone anywhere else. But I stayed still for a moment too long. Then the doors opened. A man stepped out. He was not in a hurry. He was not distracted. He moved with calm precision, like someone used to rooms adjusting themselves around his presence. Black coat. Clean lines. No visible urgency. Just control. Our eyes met briefly as I stood under the streetlight. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was simply a moment where two strangers noticed each other at the wrong time in their lives. I looked away first. But something about him made me stay where I was instead of walking away completely. He paused near the entrance, not approaching me yet, but not ignoring me either. There was a quiet awareness in the way he observed the situation, like he had already read more of it than I wanted him to see. I straightened slightly, realizing I probably looked like someone who had just escaped something she could not fully explain. The wind picked up around the corner of the building. I pulled my coat tighter around myself. That was when he finally spoke. His voice was calm, low, and controlled, but not distant. You look like you are trying to decide whether to keep walking or stop pretending you are fine. I blinked slightly. The accuracy of it unsettled me more than the statement itself. I did not answer immediately. He did not push. He simply waited. That was new. No pressure. No assumptions. Just presence. I finally spoke, my voice quieter than I expected. I am fine, I said automatically. Even as I said it, I knew it was not convincing. The man did not react with judgment. Only understanding. People usually say that right before they are not, he replied. I let out a small breath. That almost sounded like a laugh but was not. I looked away toward the street again, unsure why I had not already left. I did not know his name. I did not know why he was still standing there. I only knew that in the middle of one of the worst nights of my life, the silence he offered felt less dangerous than the life I had just walked out of. He glanced briefly toward the hotel entrance, then back at me. Do you need somewhere to sit down? He asked. The question was simple. No pressure. No expectation. It should have been easy to refuse. But I hesitated. And in that hesitation something shifted. Not trust. Not safety. Just the smallest possibility that I did not have to stand alone in the cold right now. I looked at the hotel again. Warm light spilled through the glass doors. People inside looked like they belonged somewhere. I did not. And yet, for reasons I could not explain, I finally nodded slightly. I followed him without fully realizing I had made the decision to move. It was not a conscious agreement. It was more like my body responding before my thoughts had caught up. The man led me toward the hotel entrance, holding the door open without rushing me, without speaking again. The warmth inside hit immediately, soft lighting replacing the cold wind outside. The lobby was quiet in a way that did not feel empty. It felt controlled. Expensive but not flashy. The kind of place where everything had a purpose, even silence. I stopped just inside the entrance, suddenly aware of how out of place I must have looked. My coat felt heavier. My breathing felt louder. The man did not move away. He simply stood beside me, giving me space without abandoning the situation. That was the first thing I noticed. Not pressure. Not curiosity. Just presence. You can sit over there, he said, gesturing slightly toward a seating area near the window. I hesitated again. Every rational thought in my mind was telling me to leave, to go home, to call someone I trusted. But I had already left that version of my life behind less than an hour ago. I moved toward the seating area and sat down slowly, placing my purse beside me. The chair was soft, too soft compared to the tension, still sitting in my chest. I stared at my hands for a moment, unsure what I was even waiting for. The man remained standing nearby, not directly watching me, but not ignoring me either. It felt like he understood that silence was part of whatever this was. Do you want water? He asked after a moment. I blinked slightly and looked up. I am fine, I said automatically again. The habit of it was almost automatic now. He nodded once but did not argue. Instead, he signaled quietly to someone behind the reception area. A few seconds later, a glass of water was placed on the small table in front of me. I stared at it without touching it at first. Everything about this felt too structured, too intentional for a situation I had not planned to be in. The man finally took a seat across from me, not too close, maintaining distance that still felt respectful rather than cold. "You do not look like someone who is fine," he said calmly. I let out a small breath, staring down at the glass. "I just left somewhere I should not go back to," I said quietly before I could stop myself. The words surprised even me. He did not react with shock or curiosity. He simply listened. That was worse in a way because it made it harder to dismiss him. "That is usually the moment people realize they need somewhere else to be," he said. I looked up at him again. "And you just offer that to strangers?" I asked. There was a brief pause. Not hesitation, just thought. "Not usually," he said. That answer should have made me more cautious. Instead, it made me more aware of how strange this entire interaction already was. I leaned back slightly in the chair, trying to process everything at once. My life had ended less than an hour ago in an apartment I could never return to the same way again. And now I was sitting in a luxury hotel lobby talking to a stranger who spoke like he understood emotional collapse as if it were a normal occurrence. "Why are you being kind to me?" I asked finally. The question came out quieter than I intended. He looked at me for a moment before answering. "Because kindness does not require prior permission," he said. I did not know how to respond to that. It was not dramatic. It was not romantic. It was simply steady. I looked down at the glass of water again and finally picked it up, taking a small sip. My hands were still slightly shaking, but less than before. "I do not even know your name," I said after a moment. He nodded slightly. "Alexander," he said. I repeated it in my mind once. Alexander. It sounded simple, but nothing about him felt simple. I exhaled slowly and set the glass back down. For the first time since leaving the apartment, I realized I was no longer walking alone through the night. And that realization should have scared me more than it did. I did not immediately realize how long I had been sitting in the hotel lobby until the silence between Alexander and me began to feel less like protection and more like space I was expected to fill. The glass of water in front of me was still half full. My hands were steadier now, but my thoughts were not. Everything that had happened earlier still existed inside me like a slow-moving echo I could not fully interrupt. Alexander remained seated across from me, calm in a way that made it difficult to read him. Not distant, not cold, just controlled, as if nothing in the situation had surprised him so far. I finally broke the silence. "I should probably go," I said quietly, even though I did not move. My voice sounded uncertain, like I was testing the sentence rather than stating it. Alexander looked at me without changing his expression. "Where would you go?" he asked simply. The question should have been easy to answer. I opened my mouth then closed it again. There was no immediate place I could name that did not lead back to the apartment I had just left. That realization made my chest tighten slightly. "Anywhere," I said, but even I knew it did not sound convincing. He nodded once, acknowledging the answer without challenging it. "Anywhere is not a direction," he said. I looked down at my hands again. I do not usually end up in hotel lobbies talking to strangers about directions in my life, I said quietly. That earned a brief pause from him, not amusement exactly, but something softer. "Most people do not," he said. The simplicity of his tone made it feel less absurd and more real. I leaned back slightly in the chair, trying to understand how I had arrived here so quickly from a completely different version of my life. "You are very calm about this," I said after a moment. Alexander's gaze stayed steady. "You are not the first person I have seen having a difficult night," he replied. That answer made sense, but not in a comforting way. It made him feel even more distant in experience, even if not in presence. I took a slow breath. "So what happens now?" I asked. It was not a question I had planned to ask, but it came out before I could reconsider it. Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, as if choosing his words carefully. "Now you decide what kind of night this becomes for you," he said. I frowned slightly. "That is not very specific," I said. "It is the only honest answer," he replied. I looked at him for a moment longer, trying to find a hidden meaning in his expression, but there was none that I could clearly identify. Just calm attention. No pressure. No insistence. I glanced around the lobby again. People came and went quietly. Laughter from a distant lounge area. The soft sound of footsteps on polished floors. Everything looked normal for everyone else. Except me. I turned back to him. "You do not know anything about me," I said. Alexander nodded slightly. "That is correct," he said. The honesty of it unsettled me more than any assumption would have. "Then why are you still sitting here?" I asked. For the first time, his expression shifted slightly, not into something emotional, but into something more deliberate. "Because you are not asking for attention," he said. "You are asking for stability." The words landed quietly between us. I did not respond right away. Something about how simply he said it made it harder to dismiss. I looked down at the glass of water again, then picked it up slowly. My reflection was faint in the surface. I did not recognize my own expression fully. I took another small sip before setting it down. "And you think you can provide that?" I asked. Alexander held my gaze. "Not think," he said calmly. "I know what I can offer." That answer should have sounded arrogant. Somehow it did not. It sounded structured, like he was describing something already established rather than something he was trying to convince me of. I exhaled slowly and leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows near the edge of the table. "This is still very strange," I said quietly. "Yes," he agreed without hesitation. The lack of argument made it harder to maintain distance in my thoughts. I sat there for a moment longer, realizing that I was no longer in motion. Not physically, not emotionally in the same chaotic way I had been outside. Something had shifted, even if I did not yet know what it meant. Alexander did not push the conversation further. He simply waited, as if waiting was part of his understanding of control rather than absence of action. And for the first time that night, I began to understand that I was not being rushed into anything. I was being given space to notice that I had already stopped running. I did not realize how much silence could change the shape of a moment until Alexander stopped speaking and simply observed me instead. The lobby around us continued its quiet rhythm, people coming and going through glass doors, footsteps fading into carpeted hallways, distant conversations blending into background noise that felt like another world entirely. But inside my small corner of that space, everything felt suspended. I had stopped thinking about where I should go next. That realization should have made me uncomfortable. Instead, it made me tired in a way I did not expect. Alexander remained seated across from me, his posture unchanged, his attention steady but not invasive. It was the kind of presence that did not demand anything from me, yet somehow made it harder to pretend I was still fully in control of my own direction. I finally broke the silence again, quieter this time. "I do not understand why you are still here," I said. My voice was not defensive anymore. It was honest. Alexander looked at me for a moment before responding. "Because you have not stabilized yet," he said simply. I frowned slightly. "Stabilized," I repeated. That is a very clinical way to describe a person sitting in a hotel lobby after a bad night. He did not react to that the way most people would. "No correction, no justification." Just acknowledgement. "It is accurate," he said. I leaned back slightly in the chair, staring at him more carefully now. "You speak like everything has a category," I said. "It does," he replied. That answer should have sounded cold, but it did not. It sounded like structure was simply how he interpreted the world, not something he was using to distance himself from it. I looked away toward the glass entrance again. Outside, the city continued moving without pause. Somewhere out there, my life from earlier still existed in memory, but it already felt less solid than it had a few hours ago. "I do not know what I am supposed to do next," I admitted quietly. The words surprised me as I said them. Alexander did not rush to fill the silence. He let it exist for a moment before speaking. "You are not required to decide everything tonight," he said. I glanced back at him. "It feels like I should be," I replied. He shook his head slightly. "That is an emotional response, not a practical requirement," he said. I almost smiled at that, but it faded quickly. "You really do separate everything like that," I said. "Emotion and practicality." "When necessary," he replied. I exhaled slowly and looked down at my hands again. They were finally still. That was new. I had not noticed when the shaking stopped. "So what happens now?" I asked again. If I do not leave and I do not decide anything? Alexander considered the question for a moment. Then you remain here until you are capable of making a decision without pressure from either direction, he said. I looked up at him again. And you would just allow that? I asked. Yes, he said without hesitation. The simplicity of the answer made something inside me shift again. Not trust exactly. Not yet. But something closer to relief than suspicion. I had expected persuasion. I had expected urgency. Instead, I was being given time. Time was not something I had been offered in any part of my life that mattered recently. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on my knees. You are very confident in boundaries, I said. Alexander's gaze did not move. Boundaries prevent unnecessary escalation, he replied. I let out a quiet breath, looking toward the lobby again. People still came and went, none of them aware of the small stillness happening in the corner where I sat. I think I might just be overwhelmed, I said finally. It was the closest thing to clarity I had spoken since leaving the apartment. Alexander nodded once. That is expected, he said. I looked at him again, trying to understand how someone could feel so calm in a situation that had completely disrupted my sense of normal. Do you ever get involved in situations like this often? I asked. Situations like what? He replied. I hesitated. People who have nowhere to go at midnight, I said. He considered that briefly. Not often in this form, he said. I nodded slowly, not sure what to do with that answer. The silence returned, but it was different now. Less tense. Less uncertain. More like space rather than absence. I looked down at the glass of water again, then picked it up and finished it in a few small sips. When I set it down, my hands did not shake. I noticed that clearly this time. And for the first time since the apartment, I allowed myself to sit still without feeling like I needed to escape it. The longer I remained in the hotel lobby, the more I became aware of how unusual the entire situation was. A few hours earlier, my biggest concern had been whether Ryan would like the takeout I brought home. Now I was sitting across from a stranger named Alexander, discussing emotional stability like it was a business strategy. And somehow, that felt less absurd than returning to the apartment I had left behind. The realization should have worried me. Instead, it made me curious. Alexander remained calm as ever, his attention focused without becoming intrusive. There was something unusual about the way people interacted with him as they passed through the lobby. Staff members greeted him with immediate recognition. Guests nodded politely. Even brief exchanges carried a level of respect I could not ignore. At first I assumed he was a frequent visitor. Then I started noticing details. A manager crossed the lobby and stopped briefly beside our table. Good evening, Mr. Reed, he said professionally. Please let us know if you require anything. Alexander nodded once. Thank you. The manager left immediately. Not rushed. Not nervous. Just efficient. I watched the interaction carefully. You know everyone here? I asked. Alexander looked at me. Not everyone. The answer was technically correct and somehow completely unhelpful. I glanced around the lobby again. You seem important, I said. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt slightly embarrassed. Alexander did not react. Importance is relative, he replied. I almost laughed. That sounds like something important people say. For the first time, I thought I saw the smallest hint of amusement appear in his expression before it disappeared again. Possibly, he said. The conversation settled briefly into silence. I found myself studying him more openly now. Everything about him felt deliberate. The watch he wore, the way he spoke, the confidence that never crossed into arrogance. He looked like someone completely comfortable inside his own life. I could not remember the last time I felt that way about mine. What do you do? I asked finally. Alexander leaned back slightly. Business, he said. I stared at him. Business is not a job description. It is accurate, he replied. I shook my head. You answer questions like a lawyer. That is unfortunate, he said. This time I actually smiled. Small, brief, but real. The fact that I could still smile at all surprised me. Alexander noticed but did not comment on it. Instead, he glanced toward the large windows overlooking the city. You look different than when you walked in, he said. I followed his gaze toward the lights outside. Different how? Less focused on what happened, he replied. More focused on what comes next. The observation caught me off guard because it was true. Earlier, all I could think about was betrayal. Now my mind was beginning to drift toward practical questions. Where would I stay? What would I do tomorrow? How would I rebuild a life that suddenly looked very different? I do not even know what tomorrow looks like, I admitted. Alexander nodded once. Most people do not, he said. They simply convince themselves they do. I considered that for a moment. That sounds surprisingly optimistic coming from you. It is not optimism, he replied. It is observation. I laughed quietly again, shaking my head. You really do have an observation for everything. Not everything. The answer came immediately. For some reason that made me curious. What do you not have an observation for? I asked. Alexander looked at me for a moment before answering. People who choose to keep moving forward immediately after disappointment. The response surprised me. You think that is unusual? I asked. I think it is rare, he said. The words settled between us. I looked down briefly, unsure how to respond. Nobody had described me that way before. Certainly not tonight. The lobby remained calm around us, but something had shifted again. The conversation no longer felt like a stranger helping another stranger through a difficult evening. It felt like two people slowly discovering reasons not to walk away from the conversation. And for the first time since leaving the apartment, I found myself wondering less about the man who had betrayed me and more about the man sitting across from me. The night outside the hotel had deepened while I sat in the same place across from Alexander Reed, and I was beginning to lose track of how much time had passed since I first walked through those glass doors. The world I had left behind earlier in the evening already felt distant, like something that belonged to a different version of me who made simpler decisions. Now everything felt paused, as if I had stepped outside my own timeline without fully realizing it. Alexander remained composed, his attention steady but not pressing. There was no urgency in his presence, no attempt to fill every silence with reassurance. Instead, he allowed the quiet to exist between us, and for reasons I could not fully explain that made it easier to think. I finally broke the silence again. I keep expecting you to ask me what I am going to do next, I said. My voice was softer than before, less guarded. Alexander looked at me. Would that change your answer? He asked. I hesitated. I do not know, I admitted. That honesty felt strangely unfamiliar. He nodded slightly, as if accepting that answer without judgment. Then asking would not be useful, he said. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a slow breath. You really think in terms of usefulness, I said. Not everything, he replied. I glanced at him. Only the important things? Only the things that require clarity, he said. I almost smiled again, but it faded quickly. The way he spoke made everything sound simplified, but not in a dismissive way. More like he removed unnecessary noise from every thought before expressing it. I looked toward the glass doors of the hotel lobby again. Outside, people moved through the city without hesitation, each of them heading somewhere they already understood. I wondered what that felt like. I do not have clarity right now, I said quietly. Alexander observed me for a moment. That is expected, he replied. I frowned slightly. You keep saying that, I said. Expected, understandable, normal. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he seemed to consider the words I had just used. Do you prefer different language? He asked. The question caught me off guard. I let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh. I do not know, I admitted again. That seemed to be the most honest thing I could say tonight. Alexander leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. You are not required to decide your entire situation tonight, he said. You are only required to remain present long enough to understand it. I studied him carefully. You make it sound easy, I said. It is not easy, he replied immediately. It is structured. That distinction stayed with me longer than I expected. Easy implied comfort. Structured implied control. I was beginning to understand the difference he kept trying to explain without ever directly naming it. I looked down at the glass of water again, noticing it was now completely empty. I had finished it without realizing. I do not usually end up in situations like this, I said quietly. Alexander looked at me with a faint acknowledgement. Most people do not, he said. Then why does it feel like you are used to it? I asked before I could stop myself. That question made him pause for a moment longer than usual. Not in discomfort. In thought. Because I have seen enough versions of it to recognize the pattern, he said. I tilted my head slightly. Versions. He nodded. People do not arrive here in identical ways, he said. But they often arrive for similar reasons. I considered that carefully. The idea that my situation was not unique was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. And what reason am I here for? I asked. Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied me with a level of attention that felt precise but not invasive. You are here because something familiar ended, he said finally. The words landed quietly. Not dramatic. Not exaggerated. Just accurate enough to make me look away for a moment. I exhaled slowly and rested my hands together on the table. That sounds like a very polite way of describing a breakup, I said. It is more than that, he replied. I looked back at him. How? Alexander held my gaze. Because what ended was not only a relationship, he said. It was the assumption that your environment was stable. That statement made me go still. I had not thought of it that way before. I had thought of betrayal, loss, shock, but not structure, not stability. I leaned back slightly, processing it. You are very good at reframing things, I said quietly. I am good at identifying them, he corrected. There was a difference in his words that I could not ignore. I looked around the lobby again. Everything still appeared normal. People still came and went. Conversation still happened in soft tones. But something inside me no longer aligned with the idea that my night was ordinary. I turned back to Alexander. So what happens now? I asked, more grounded than before. He looked at me steadily. Now you decide how long you are willing to sit with uncertainty before choosing direction, he said. I let out a slow breath and nodded slightly, even though I was not entirely sure what my direction would be. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I was no longer thinking about escaping the moment I was in. I was beginning to understand it instead. I stayed seated in the hotel lobby longer than I intended, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time that night, moving felt less urgent than thinking. The world around me continued its steady rhythm. People passing through glass doors, elevators opening and closing, quiet conversations blending into the background. But my attention was no longer focused on escaping the moment I was in. It was focused on understanding it. Alexander Reed remained across from me, still composed, still observant, as if nothing about my silence required filling. That alone felt unfamiliar. Most people would have tried to comfort me or distract me, or redirect the conversation towards something lighter. He did none of that. He simply stayed present, as if waiting for me to reach my own conclusion. I finally spoke, my voice quieter than before. You do not try to fix things immediately, I said. Alexander looked at me without shifting his posture. Not when the situation requires understanding first, he replied. I nodded slightly, absorbing that. Most people would already be telling me what I should do, I said. Most people are responding to discomfort, he said calmly. I let out a small breath that almost became a laugh but did not fully form. And you are not uncomfortable? I asked. For the first time that night, a subtle pause appeared before he answered. Comfort is not relevant to decision-making, he said. That answer should have felt cold. Instead, it felt steady. I leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of the evening settle more evenly instead of pushing against it. My thoughts no longer felt chaotic. They felt arranged, even if I had not arranged them myself. I keep thinking about what you said earlier, I admitted. Alexander tilted his head slightly, signaling he was listening. About stability, I continued. About things already being structured around me. He did not interrupt. I looked down at my hands briefly. If that is true, I said slowly, then what exactly am I supposed to be doing right now? Alexander considered the question for a moment. You are doing it, he said. I frowned slightly. Sitting here. He nodded once. Processing, he clarified. The simplicity of the answer unsettled me more than anything complicated would have. I looked toward the hotel entrance again. The city outside continued as if nothing had changed. It feels strange, I said quietly. Not knowing what comes next, but not feeling like I need to run from it either. Alexander observed me carefully. That is because you are no longer in immediate reaction mode, he said. I turned back to him. Immediate reaction mode, I repeated. That sounds clinical again. It is descriptive, he said. I shook my head slightly, but there was no frustration behind it anymore. You really do reduce everything into categories, I said. Only when it helps clarity, he replied. I exhaled slowly, looking down at the empty glass in front of me again. Somewhere between leaving the apartment and sitting here, something inside me had shifted without permission. The panic had not disappeared completely, but it no longer controlled every thought. That realization felt important in a way I did not fully understand yet. I think I am starting to understand what you mean, I said quietly. Alexander did not respond immediately, but his attention sharpened slightly, as if acknowledging the significance of that sentence. I continued, choosing my words carefully. You are not asking me to decide everything at once, I said. You are asking me to stay long enough to see what is actually happening around me. He nodded once. Yes, he said. That single word felt heavier than all his explanations combined. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands together on the table. And if I decide I do not like what I see? I asked. Alexander met my gaze directly. Then you will still have clarity, he said. I studied him for a long moment. There was no persuasion in his voice. No urgency. Only structure again, but now I was beginning to understand that structure was not a restriction to him. It was a way of removing confusion. I looked around the lobby one more time. The same space that had felt overwhelming earlier now felt manageable, almost distant. I did not know what my decision would be yet, but for the first time since the apartment door closed behind me, I was no longer reacting to my life. I was beginning to observe it. I did not realize how long I had been sitting in the hotel lobby until the conversation between Alexander and me naturally reached a point where silence no longer felt like an interruption. It felt like conclusion without finality. The city outside continued its steady rhythm through the glass walls, cars passing, people moving, lights shifting across the surface of the street like nothing significant had changed. But something inside me had changed in a way I could not easily reverse. Alexander remained seated across from me, still composed, still attentive, but no longer actively guiding the conversation. It felt as if he had already said everything necessary, and now the responsibility had quietly shifted to me. I looked down at my hands, then back up at him. You never really told me what you expect from me, I said softly. My voice no longer carried confusion in the same way it had earlier. It was more deliberate now. Alexander regarded me for a moment before responding. Expectation implies pressure, he said. I am not applying pressure. I frowned slightly. Then what is this? I asked. He did not answer immediately, which felt different now than before. Earlier, his pauses felt like calculation. Now they felt like confirmation. This is awareness, he said finally. I let out a slow breath and leaned back slightly in the chair. Awareness of what exactly? I asked. Alexander's gaze stayed steady. Of your position, he said. The answer no longer startled me the way it might have earlier in the night. Instead, I found myself processing it more carefully, as if I had learned how to listen to him differently. I glanced toward the glass entrance again. The world outside still existed in its normal structure. People still moved with purpose, most of them unaware of anything beyond their immediate paths. I used to think my life was simple, I said quietly. Not perfect, just understandable. Alexander nodded slightly. Most people believe that, he said. I turned back toward him. And you do not? I asked. I observe complexity before simplicity becomes a conclusion, he replied. I almost smiled at that, but it faded quickly into thoughtfulness instead. There was something unsettling about how easily he categorized everything, but there was also something stabilizing about it. It removed ambiguity, even if it replaced it with something more structured. I took a slow breath. I think I am starting to see what you meant earlier, I said. Alexander did not interrupt. I continued. You are not trying to convince me of anything, I said. You are just showing me what is already in motion. He held my gaze. Correct, he said. That single word felt heavier than any explanation he had given before. I looked down at the empty glass on the table, turning it slightly with my fingertips. My reflection appeared faintly in the surface again, but this time it looked less like someone lost and more like someone trying to understand direction for the first time. If I leave right now, I said slowly, what changes? Alexander considered the question carefully. Nothing immediate, he said. Your environment continues as it was before you entered here. I nodded slightly. And if I stay longer? I asked. Then your understanding becomes more complete, he said. I let out a quiet breath. The simplicity of his answer made the decision feel less like a turning point, and more like a continuation of something I had already stepped into without realizing it. I looked at him for a long moment. You make it sound like I am not actually choosing anything yet, I said. Alexander's expression remained calm. You are choosing how much you want to see before deciding, he said. That statement stayed with me longer than anything else. Not because it was persuasive, but because it was accurate in a way I could no longer deny. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands together again. The tension that had defined the beginning of this night was no longer fully present. It had been replaced by something quieter. Not certainty, not trust, but recognition that my situation was not as undefined as it had first appeared. I think I understand now, I said quietly. Alexander did not respond immediately, but his attention sharpened slightly, as if acknowledging the significance of the shift. I continued. You are not offering me a sudden change, I said. You are letting me realize what has already been changing. He nodded once. Yes, he said. The silence that followed no longer felt heavy. It felt structured. I looked around the hotel lobby one more time, noticing details I had not paid attention to earlier. The calm movements of staff, the controlled environment, the steady rhythm of a place designed for stability. For the first time since leaving the apartment, I was not trying to escape the moment I was in. I was beginning to understand that I had already entered something that required a different kind of attention. And Alexander Reed, sitting quietly across from me, was no longer a stranger I happened to meet by chance. He was the point where everything I thought I knew about direction had begun to shift.